HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Escape Line: How the Ordinary Heroes of Dutch Paris Resisted the Nazi Occupation of Western Europe, by Megan Koreman. Read by Christa Lewis. Introduction. The Choice. In the early summer of 1942, 2 years into the German occupation of the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France, a Dutch businessman named Jean Weidner received a letter at his textile shop in the unoccupied zone of France known as Vichy. It came from a Jewish business acquaintance who had fled the Netherlands rather than report for deportation to the east. He explained that he and his wife, a renowned soprano, had made it through occupied territory, over the Dutch border, over the Belgian border, and over the demarcation line that divided France, only to be arrested by Vichy French police. A judge had given them the standard sentence handed out to foreigners caught near a border in southern France: 1 month in prison. They feared they would be sent to one of Vichy's notorious internment camps at the end of that month. Although he carried a Dutch passport, Weidner had grown up on the Franco-Swiss border and spoke French more fluently than Dutch. He had nothing to worry about from the French authorities as long as he did not draw attention to himself. His business was doing well. He had just married. To help his acquaintance, he could take one of several courses of action, each more dangerous to himself. He could choose to do nothing and avoid trouble by ignoring the letter. Or he could offer legally sanctioned forms of assistance, such as sending money to the prison to pay for extra food. He could also pass the problem to the Dutch consulate in Lyon. In fact, Weidner had done some volunteer work on behalf of refugees over the previous 2 years, and knew that the consul could arrange for the couple to be placed in résidence assignée in a village rather than in an internment camp. At that time, assigned residence looked like a safe enough place for Dutch Jews. But Weidner and his new French wife, Elisabeth Cartier, were not the sort to compromise on matters of principle. The son of a Seventh-day Adventist minister, Weidner had been raised in a devout household with a clear vision of right and wrong and an absolute dedication to righteous living. On a more practical level, he knew how bad conditions actually were in Vichy's internment camps, and that the Nazis and their collaborators had malicious intentions toward Jews. He also knew that neutral Switzerland would provide protection from the Germans, but that the Swiss authorities had closed the borders. Weidner and Cartier made a choice that might have seemed normal to them but seems astonishingly heroic in retrospect. They decided to smuggle Weidner's acquaintances into Switzerland. The Jewish couple would then be safe from the Nazis, but they themselves would no longer be safe in France. By spiriting the fugitives away as soon as they were released from prison, by hiding them for a few days, and by arranging for them to cross the Franco-Swiss border illegally, Weidner and Cartier broke a number of French and Swiss laws. In the context of the occupation and the Second World War, breaking such laws in order to rescue a Jewish couple from persecution turned Weidner and Cartier into outlaws. In fact, by breaking what they felt were unjust laws, not for their own gain, but in order to protect others from persecution, they joined the resistance. Resistance cannot be understood apart from its context of daily life under German occupation. Civilians everywhere struggled with shortages, oppression, and fear, but the magnitude and details of each differed from one occupation zone to the next. They also changed over time with the progress of the war and the reaction of the occupation authorities to military developments. Every civilian had to work out some sort of personal accommodation to living under occupation. Collaborators joined the occupiers and, at least at the beginning, enjoyed the privileges of power. The vast majority of civilians withdrew into the daily struggle of making ends meet and surviving. Resistors accommodated themselves to the occupation by opposing it. Like Weidner and Cartier, they shifted from law-abiding citizens to lawbreakers. Occupation, however, did not take the same form in every country or even in every region of a country. In May and June 1940, Hitler's Wehrmacht swept through Western Europe in 6 weeks, leaving civilians in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France stunned. But Hitler had much more fundamentally dark aspirations than simply conquering Europe. He intended to refashion society according to the Nazi worldview. His 1,000-year Reich would abolish democracy in favor of a vaguely feudal system of leaders and followers. It would tolerate no rival ideologies such as communism or Christianity. As became clear over time, starting with the euthanasia programs practiced on German citizens in the mid-1930s, the Reich would favor those whom Nazi ideology deemed superior at the cost of those it branded inferior. Nazis based these categorizations on a pseudoscience of race that claimed that an individual's bloodline or genetics determined that person's rightful place in the world. In their view, Germanic Aryans reigned supreme, followed by other so-called Germanic nations such as the Dutch. Then came other Western European nations, such as the French. The Slavs of Eastern Europe figured on this Nazi scheme as subhuman. Jews occupied the lowest rung, both beneath everyone else and the greatest threat to Aryans. German occupation policy followed this Nazi ideology, treating each ethnic nation according to its place on the Nazi racial hierarchy. The Dutch people, who played such an important role in the story this book tells, had their own particular experience of occupation. After the Wehrmacht invaded the Netherlands, Queen Wilhelmina and Prime Minister Peter Gerbrandy escaped to exile in London, leaving behind bureaucrats with orders to keep the civil service functioning for the sake of the people. Hitler installed a civilian occupation regime in the country. This sounded better than it turned out to be because it allowed zealots from the Nazi Party and the Nazi Party's police agencies, such as the Gestapo, to establish themselves in positions of power with very few checks on their activities. At the beginning of the occupation, when the Nazis still assumed that the Dutch would be happy to join their vision of Aryan domination, the German authorities allotted the Dutch preferential treatment. They released Dutch prisoners of war, for instance, but imprisoned French POWs. In February 1941, however, they reacted brutally to the strike that the people of Amsterdam called to protest the mistreatment of Jews. Relations deteriorated steadily after that. The authorities closed Dutch universities. The German commander in the Netherlands recalled Dutch POWs for internment and labor in April 1943. At the end of the war, the German occupation forces deliberately starved those Dutch civilians caught under their control during the deadly hunger winter of 1944 to 45. In contrast, Hitler installed a military occupation regime in Belgium, where he had no reason to expect the people to welcome German troops. Belgians had not forgotten the German occupation of their country in the First World War, during which they endured starvation, harsh punishments, and the forced deportation of tens of thousands of men as slave labor. Because the commanding officer of the occupation troops in Belgium during the Second World War was not himself a Nazi, party zealots had difficulty establishing themselves and their agencies in the country. They were present, of course, but not to the same degree or with the same power as in the Netherlands. In effect, the military occupation shielded the Belgian people from the worst excesses of Nazi rule. The Germans still deported Jews from Belgium. They still rounded up young men from the streets of Brussels as slave labor for the Third Reich. The Belgian people still suffered from rationing, curfews, and other restrictions, but there was more food in Belgium than in the Netherlands. and at least one Dutch resister who crossed back and forth between the countries felt freer and safer in Belgium than at home. France, farther south, was yet another matter. Technically, the Wehrmacht did not defeat the French army in June 1940 because the French government signed an armistice with Hitler before that could happen. The armistice divided France into 5 occupation zones. The northern departments along the Belgian border were placed under the control of the military occupation authorities in Brussels. Alsace was annexed to the Third Reich. The rest of the northern third of the country and the western seaboard along the Atlantic were occupied and placed under the control of a German commandant in Paris. For the moment, a small area along the Alps went to Germany's ally Italy. The southern part of the country remained unoccupied, but also cut off from the rest of the country by a demarcation line as closely guarded as an international border. The southern unoccupied zone was also known as the Free Zone, or most commonly Vichy, because the French government had settled in the spa town of Vichy after fleeing from Paris ahead of the invading German army. France had been a republic until that military crisis, when Parliament voted to confer full powers on Marshal Philippe Pétain, who turned the government into the État français, or French state. As the preserve of right-wing conservatives, the Vichy regime sympathized with Nazi social goals. As one example, they both encouraged women to leave the workplace in order to raise children. More tellingly, in the context of the times, the Vichy regime repudiated the French Republic's welcoming attitude to immigrants, to the point of revoking the naturalized status of people who had earned their French citizenship more than 10 years earlier. From the perspective of most French civilians, however, Vichy's greatest failing was its attempt to maintain French sovereignty and to win a favorable position in Hitler's new order. This led the regime to insist that French police do the Germans' dirty work, such as rounding up Jews for deportation. Similarly, Vichy insisted on choosing the hostages the Germans would shoot, thereby implicating the French government in crimes against its own citizens. After the Germans occupied the southern zone in November 1942 and dismantled the demarcation line in March 1943, the État français continued to administer the southern zone, promote its own agenda, and cooperate with the German occupation authorities until the liberation in 1944. No matter where they lived, all civilians in occupied Europe suffered from the fundamental restrictions imposed on daily life by pervasive shortages. Production of both food and manufactured goods fell below pre-war levels and stayed there. Farmers had to contend with insufficient help, a lack of fertilizer, broken equipment that could not be repaired, and increased paperwork. Something as trivial as a shortage of baling twine could confound an entire hay harvest. In addition, coal, gasoline, and other natural resources were routinely diverted from civilian to military use. Every government imposed rationing systems that shared out the common resources with more or less success. Civilians had to use ration coupons or tickets to buy most kinds of food, clothing, shoes, and fuel. People stretched their resources with things like clothing swaps and even converting gasoline engines in delivery vans and buses into wood-burning engines known as gazogène. These shortages had far-reaching implications for everyday life. Women and children spent long hours standing in line to buy basic necessities. Shortages of food undermined the general population's health. Shortages of clothing chipped away at morale as everyone started looking more ragged and people had to walk around in uncomfortable shoes with wooden soles. The gasoline shortage meant that only Germans, collaborators, and emergency services drove in cars. Everyone else walked, pedaled bicycles with wooden wheels, or crowded onto the trains and trams. Popular opinion, not unjustified, held that only the Germans and their collaborators were well-fed and well-dressed during the war. The constant shortages led citizens into routine disobedience. When the official rationing systems failed, as they often did, people had no choice but to turn to the black market. The black market encompassed every shade of gray, from a farm wife selling her cousin extra eggs at pre-war prices to organized criminal gangs charging extortionate rates. But any shade of gray counted as breaking the law, which meant that almost everyone broke the law on a regular basis. From there, it was not such a big step to breaking the law against reading underground newspapers. Indeed, the occupation led most civilians into complicated negotiations between the law, their conscience, and their needs. Even that strict pillar of rectitude, Jean Weidner's pastor father, engaged in hair-splitting. When a German soldier rang his doorbell in The Hague to confiscate bicycles, Weidner Sr. told him that his wife's bicycle was on the first floor. Because the Germans were interested only in men's bicycles, the soldier left. If the soldier had been more precise in his language, though, and asked about men's bicycles, the minister would have felt obliged to tell him that his own bicycle was also in the house. It was still a great leap to active resistance, but maybe not so far to small acts that supported resistance, such as looking the other way. The restrictions of wartime life extended far beyond the persistent lack of food, fuel, and goods into the less tangible realm of civil liberties. Occupation meant a sharp increase in policing and surveillance by a variety of German police agencies, as well as by collaborationist units and the local police. In addition to the notorious Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, civilians could fall afoul of the regular German police commonly known as the Grüne Polizei, Green Police, for their uniforms, the DSK, Devisenschutzkommando, who controlled the flow of currency and valuables, the SD, Sicherheitsdienst or SS Security Service, or even military police authorities such as the Abwehr, military intelligence, or the Geheime Feldpolizei, GFP, secret military police, some of whom did not wear uniforms. At some point, German custom agents and border troops reinforced the local guards on the borders. Paramilitary collaborators, such as the milice in France, also wielded police powers, as did the regular local and national police forces. In many places, particularly near borders, civilians required special passes to be more than a few miles from home. In fact, the occupation authorities required civilian adults and teenagers to carry identification papers at all times. At minimum, men and women needed basic identification cards issued by the local authority. The identification cards introduced in the Netherlands during the occupation were deliberately complex and difficult to forge. The Belgians, on the other hand, kept their identification card as simple and easy to forge as possible. In addition, civilians needed to show their ration cards and, depending on the circumstances, marriage certificates, work certificates, and documents detailing why a man of military age was not in uniform. Police could demand these documents at any time and place, although they were less likely to accost a woman in a rural hamlet than a man in a big city. Censorship, of course, restricted the circulation of news and information. Listening to the news on BBC Radio from London or Swiss Radio constituted a criminal offense, one that Vichy prosecuted. Nevertheless, many underground papers relayed the news from the BBC or Swiss Radio in order to counterbalance the obvious propaganda printed in official papers. In France, civilians also had to watch what they said on the telephone and wrote in letters because of the censors. The Nazis may have acted more circumspectly in the West than in the East, but they still behaved like the victorious conquerors they were. They pursued their enemies and exploited the occupied territories and their inhabitants to their own advantage and according to their own ideology. In the West, the occupation authorities began persecuting Jews in subtle ways, such as gradually isolating them and depriving them of their livelihood. They did not massacre Jews there. Instead, they resettled them in the East, which meant sending them to extermination camps in order to kill them. The process of deporting Jews began in early 1942. By the middle of 1943, most Jews there had either been interned or deported or had found ways to escape or hide. German agencies and their collaborators continued to hunt for Jews until the end. The exigencies of fighting the war, however, began to outweigh Nazi ideology in occupation policies and patterns of persecution. By mid-1943, the Third Reich was starting to crack under the strain of military events. Although the Wehrmacht enjoyed great success when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Eastern Front drained Germany of men and material. The military tide turned against the Wehrmacht in February 1943 with its catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. By that time, the United States had entered the war, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and had had time to establish air bases in England, from which the Allies bombed German cities. Because the Wehrmacht was engaged over vast territories and suffering staggering losses on the Eastern Front, almost all German men were in uniform rather than in their factories or on their farms. Refusing to mobilize German women for ideological reasons, the Nazis had been replacing their own workforce with foreign labor since the war began. Some of these workers were paid. Some were no more than slaves, kidnapped off the streets of their home villages. Some were political prisoners, and some were POWs. Even so, there were not enough of them to keep the war machine going. In 1943, the occupation authorities demanded workers from the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. When not enough men volunteered for the jobs, they established forced labor drafts. The occupation authorities introduced compulsory labor in the Third Reich for Belgians in October 1942. In the Netherlands, they gave the previously protected group of university students the choice of signing a loyalty oath in spring 1943 or reporting for work in Germany with their age cohort. The Vichy authorities tried various plans until implementing a forced labor draft in February 1943. The general population in all three countries resented these measures and considered the men involved to be the victims of persecution. Some men reported for duty, but others went into hiding or fled to neutral lands. In southern France, the forced labor draft, more than any other issue, turned opinion in favor of the resistance. Resistors opposed the German occupation of their countries and Nazi ideology in a variety of ways, which can be usefully categorized as military or civil. As you would expect, military resistance engaged the enemy through violence by such means as sabotage and partisan warfare, as well as gathering intelligence of use to the Allied armies. The actions of military resistors have always received more attention than those of civil resistors, if only because they made a more noticeable impact. Everyone within miles knew if a train derailed or an ammunition dump exploded. More devastating, the Germans usually demanded the deaths of 50 civilians in retribution for the assassination of one German officer in France. The victims of such reprisals rarely had anything at all to do with the attack or even the resistance. At the liberation, it was the military resistors who joined the Allied armies and rounded up collaborators in their hometowns. Civil resistance, on the other hand, used much quieter, nonviolent means to protect civil society from the inroads of Nazism. It rarely provoked reprisals. The printing and distributing of illegal newspapers, magazines, and books counts as civil resistance, as do illegal efforts to keep democracy going by, for example, taking a political party underground and preparing for a post-war future led by the resistance. Resistance with a capital R refers to this politically organized movement that gained official status after the war. The resistance with a small r refers to the more widespread, spontaneous, and grassroots efforts of civilians to oppose the Nazi occupation. You could resist without belonging to a resistance network. Resistance began with the occupation, as small groups of people found ways to oppose the new status quo. The form of resistance depended on the location and skills of the man or woman who had the original idea. Families who lived on the Dutch border, for example, helped British and French soldiers get across it so they could escape capture during the debacle of 1940. Educated individuals in Paris and other cities wrote newsletters by hand or typed several copies with carbon paper and distributed them. For the most part, these grassroots resistance organizations began as local efforts by people with some personal connection with each other, even if it was once or twice removed through a relative or coworker. The connection often involved membership in some sort of community, whether a village, a political party, a church, a school, a sports team, or a place of employment. This trusted circle of like-minded conspirators did not necessarily have all the skills or goods they needed. They might not have the artistic ability to forge identity documents or a job in a police station that would tell them when to expect the next German patrol. That meant they would have to risk exposing their illegal activities to a stranger who did have access to what they needed. If they chose well, that stranger joined the group. Certain people with jobs at the intersection of the clandestine and official worlds, such as police officers and secretaries in town halls, were likely to be approached by more than one group and may even have started their own. They served as a nexus of resistance in their area, creating connections between groups that would otherwise have no contact. Over time, nationwide resistance networks and movements developed. Some, such as the French Libération Sud, which later joined the Mouvement Uni de la Résistance, United Movements of the Resistance, grew out of pre-war political contacts and activities. Others, such as the Noyautage d'Administration Publique, civil service network, relied upon the cooperation of professional colleagues. Such national networks expanded in two ways. They either started a branch in a new place themselves or merged with an already existing group. A small local circle might join a national network out of a sense that they could do more united with others or because the network offered the money and expertise they needed. In the French case, resistance developed in two places, in France itself and abroad. General Charles de Gaulle, who retreated to London when the Germans occupied France, established himself as the leader of the Free French. He sent representatives into occupied France to unite the various resistance movements there under his authority in order to give legitimacy to his claims to represent the French among the Allies. Most, but not all, of the large French networks joined de Gaulle because they could appreciate the benefits of opposing the Germans with a united front. The Maquis, or military partisan units, for example, had a better chance of getting weapons if they belonged to the official forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFE, French Forces of the Interior, under de Gaulle. The resistance succeeded inasmuch as de Gaulle led the provisional government at the liberation, but it never fully represented all resistors in France. The Dutch, on the other hand, came closest to having both a unified and national resistance and resistance. The Allies also involved themselves in resistance where it could benefit the military campaign by causing trouble behind enemy lines or protecting Allied servicemen. Both the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, parachuted agents into occupied Europe. Some were sent to train military resistors and equip them to support the regular armies. Some were sent to gather military intelligence.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?